I never thought I'd end up here, sitting in my dimly lit apartment, the only sound the hum of my aging laptop, as I try to purge the memories of a job that changed me forever. They say confession is good for the soul, but I don't think whoever coined that phrase had seen what I have. The things I did, the things I let happen. I worked as a security guard for most of my adult life. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Or it did. I've bounced between warehouses, malls, and parking lots, where the worst you deal with is a drunk teenager or an alarm triggered by a stray cat. But a few years ago, I landed a gig that was different. It wasn't just a job. It was an experience, one I can't explain even now. The company was Proctor Security, and they hired me for a facility in the middle of nowhere. That's not hyperbole. The place was a solid 40 miles from the nearest gas station, surrounded by dense woods and a silence so profound it pressed on your ears. The job was simple on paper. Monitor cameras, patrol the premises, and follow the rules. The rules. That's what this confession is about, the rules. I've worked a lot of places, and every job has its quirks, its set of guidelines to follow. But the rules at Proctor, they weren't just strange. They were unnatural. Here's a taste of what I mean. Rule 1. Never look at the security cameras between midnight and 1 a.m. If something appears on the monitors during this time, pretend you didn't see it. Rule 2. At 3:33 a.m., leave your station and stand in front of the main entrance. Greet the visitor by saying, "Good evening." You're right on time. Rule 3. If you hear knocking on the walls, count to 10 before responding. If the knocking continues, do not respond. Rule 4. The woman in red is not real. If you see her, do not speak to her. Do not let her speak to you. When I first read the rule book, I laughed. I thought it was a joke, some hazing ritual for the new guy. But the supervisor, a grizzled man named Harris, didn't laugh with me. He just stared, his weathered face devoid of humor. "Follow the rules," he said. "No exceptions." I should have walked out right then. But the pay was good, better than any security job I'd had before. And I needed it. Bills don't wait, and I had plenty of them. For the first few nights, it was uneventful. Quiet, even. The cameras showed empty hallways and locked doors. My rounds were routine. The only sounds my footsteps and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I started to think the rules were just corporate paranoia, an over-the-top way to ensure guards stayed alert. Then came my first encounter with the rules. It was a Tuesday, around 12:15 a.m. I was sitting at the monitor station, fighting off sleep, when something flickered on the screen. One of the cameras, pointed at the eastern corridor, showed movement. Not a person, not an animal, just movement. It was subtle at first, like a shadow darting out of frame. I leaned closer, squinting at the grainy feed, when I remembered Rule 1. My hand froze halfway to the controls. Don't look at the cameras between midnight and 1 a.m. Pretend you didn't see it. The shadow reappeared, lingering longer this time. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched like they didn't belong to a human body. I felt my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to look away. That was the first time I realized the rules weren't just arbitrary. They were warnings. By the end of my first week, I'd memorized every rule by heart, each one etched into my mind like a mantra. I followed them religiously, terrified of what might happen if I didn't. And yet, the longer I worked there, the more questions I had. Who or what was the visitor? Why did the cameras act like they had a mind of their own? And the woman in red, God help me, I'd seen her, just once. But that was enough. I've carried these memories for years, trying to convince myself they weren't real. But late at night, when the world is quiet, I know the truth. The rules weren't just rules, they were a lifeline. And breaking them? Well, breaking them was something no one came back from. So here I am, typing this confession for strangers on the internet. Maybe you'll believe me, maybe you won't. But if you ever find yourself working a security job in some remote, godforsaken place, and they hand you a rule book that seems a little too specific, do yourself a favor. Walk away, because some rules aren't meant to be broken. I still remember the day I got the call. It was a Monday afternoon, and I was sitting on my worn-out couch, trying to figure out how to stretch my last paycheck. bills were piling up. Rent, utilities, a medical debt I couldn't seem to shake. When the phone rang, I nearly let it go to voicemail. "Mr. Harper?" The voice on the other end asked. "This is Alan," I said cautiously. "This is Proctor Security. We reviewed your application and would like to offer you a position at one of our facilities. Are you still interested?" I almost didn't take the job. The location they mentioned, Cedar Hollow, wasn't on any map I could find, and the pay seemed too good to be true. But desperation makes people do foolish things. I said yes. 2 days later, I found myself driving down a narrow, tree-lined road. My GPS had given up 20 miles back, replaced by static directions from Harris, the gruff supervisor I'd spoken to on the phone. "Turn left at the old church," he'd said. "Then keep going until you see the gate. Don't stop, no matter what." The gate appeared like a mirage, rising out of the fog. It was massive, iron, and topped with spirals of razor wire. A guardhouse stood nearby, empty except for a flickering fluorescent bulb. As I pulled up, the gate groaned open on its own, the sound loud enough to send a shiver down my spine. I drove through, my car crawling along the gravel path toward a squat, windowless building in the distance. It wasn't what I expected. I pictured a warehouse or maybe a corporate office, but this was more like a bunker. Harris was waiting for me inside, a clipboard in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen its share of fights. He didn't smile when I introduced myself, just handed me the clipboard and gestured toward a chair. "Fill this out. NDA's at the bottom. Read it carefully." The paperwork was standard background checks, emergency contacts, that sort of thing. But the non-disclosure agreement was something else. It was 5 pages long, filled with legal jargon that made my head spin. One line stood out, though. "Under no circumstances are employees permitted to share details of their work with anyone outside Proctor Security." Harris grunted when I handed the clipboard back. "Good. Follow me." He led me down a dimly lit hallway, the air cool and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were bare concrete, the floors scuffed with years of wear. A faint hum echoed around us, the source of it impossible to pinpoint. "This is the main floor," Harris said. "You'll spend most of your time here." He pointed to a bank of monitors mounted on the wall. "Camera feeds cover every inch of the property. Keep an eye on them during your shift. If you see anything unusual, follow the rules." We stopped at a locked door at the end of the hallway. Harris pulled out a keycard and swiped it, revealing a small break room with a coffee machine, a mini fridge, and a few folding chairs. He handed me a thick, leather-bound book. "This is your rule book," he said. "Read it. Memorize it. I'm serious, don't skip a single page. The rules keep you safe." I stared at the book, its worn cover stamped with the words Employee Handbook. It felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that settles in your gut and refuses to leave. "What's with all the rules?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Do you believe in things you can't explain?" The question caught me off guard. "Like ghosts?" I asked, half laughing. His expression didn't change. "Like things that don't follow the rules of this world." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. After a moment, Harris sighed and straightened up. "You'll understand soon enough," he said. "Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." That night was my first shift. The monitors flickered to life as I settled into the chair, their glow casting long shadows across the room. The screens showed the building's interior and exterior. Endless hallways, empty rooms, and the parking lot where my car was the only vehicle in sight. I spent the first hour flipping through the rulebook. The rules were listed in bold print, each one followed by a brief explanation. Rule 1. Never look at the security cameras between midnight and 1 a.m. If you do, don't acknowledge what you see. They want attention. Don't give it to them. Rule 2. At 3:33 a.m., go to the main entrance and greet the visitor. Do not let them think you're afraid. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. They're testing you. Passing the test is silence. Rule 4. The woman in red is not real. Do not engage with her. She'll try to convince you otherwise. Each rule was more bizarre than the last. By the time I reached the end, my head was spinning. I wanted to believe it was all some elaborate prank, but Harris's grave demeanor made it hard to dismiss. The night passed slowly, every creak and groan of the building setting me on edge. The cameras stayed quiet, their feeds grainy but uneventful. At 3:33 a.m., my alarm went off, jolting me from my half-dazed state. I made my way to the main entrance, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The rulebook didn't explain who or what the visitor was, and I half expected to find nothing but empty air when I opened the door. Instead, the air shifted. It was subtle, like the pressure in the room had dropped, and the faint scent of burnt wood filled my nose. I couldn't see anything, but I forced myself to speak the words. "Good evening. You're right on time." The shift ended at 6 a.m., and by the time I got home, I was exhausted. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire night. It's strange how quickly you can adapt to the bizarre. By my third shift, the rules felt almost normal, like a twisted routine I didn't dare deviate from. I told myself the job was just another paycheck, a stepping stone until something better came along. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a job. It was something else entirely. By the end of my first week, the rules had become a lifeline, a twisted mantra I clung to as the nights grew stranger. The cameras still flickered at midnight, but I kept my eyes fixed on the rulebook or the clock, never daring to look. At 3:33 a.m., I'd march to the main entrance and greet the visitor, feeling the same pressure in the air, the same faint scent of burnt wood. Nothing happened beyond that, but the absence of something was often worse than an actual encounter. But then things began to escalate. It was a Tuesday night, technically Wednesday morning, and I was going through my rounds. The building was eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights and my boots against the concrete floors. I had memorized the layout by then, and I could do the route blindfolded. As I approached the eastern corridor, I noticed a strange flickering in the corner of my eye. One of the lights overhead was blinking erratically, casting jittery shadows along the walls. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding as I realized the shadows didn't match the shape of the furniture or fixtures. One shadow moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it shifted just enough to make my breath hitch. The rulebook didn't say anything about moving shadows, but I knew enough to keep walking. As I moved, the shadow seemed to follow, sliding along the wall like spilled ink. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus on the end of the hallway. I wanted to run, but something in the back of my mind screamed that running would be the worst thing I could do. When I reached the corner, I dared a glance back. The shadow was gone. 2 nights later, I was sitting in the monitor room, absently flipping through the rulebook while the cameras displayed their usual uneventful feeds. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I heard it, a faint sound, like someone pacing just outside the room. Footsteps. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. The sound continued, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to hear. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. They're testing you. Passing the test is silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the urge to move. The sound stayed there, just beyond the thin barrier, for what felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps faded. I didn't move for the rest of my shift. By now, the routine of greeting the visitor had become almost mechanical. Every night at 3:33 a.m., I'd leave the monitor room, walk to the main entrance, and recite the same line, "Good evening. You're right on time." But one night, the ritual changed. It started as usual. I stood at the entrance, the words ready on my lips. The air shifted, the scent of burnt wood creeping into my nose. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, a voice whispered from the darkness. "Do you believe?" The question sent a chill down my spine. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. An impossibility hanging in the still air. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The rulebook didn't say anything about the visitor speaking, and I didn't want to test what might happen if I answered. The voice didn't come again. After a long, tense moment, the pressure in the air lifted, and I returned to the monitor room, shaken. I hadn't seen her in the first few weeks, and part of me had begun to believe she wasn't real. Maybe she was just a story to scare new employees into following the rules. I was wrong. It happened on a Friday night. I was patrolling the North Wing, a part of the facility that always felt colder than the rest. As I turned a corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. She was there, standing at the far end of the hallway. The woman in red. Her dress was a deep, almost blood-like crimson, and it clung to her figure as if it had been painted on. Her hair was black and glossy, cascading over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. But her face was wrong. It wasn't just pale, it was blank, like a porcelain doll with no features. I stared, my breath caught in my throat, as she tilted her head slightly, as if examining me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to remember the rule. The woman in red is not real. Do not engage with her. She began to walk toward me, her movements smooth and unnatural, like she was gliding rather than stepping. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stayed rooted in place, clinging to the rulebook's words like a lifeline. As she drew closer, she spoke, her voice soft and lilting, like the whisper of a breeze. "You can see me, can't you?" I bit down on my tongue, refusing to respond. Her head tilted further, her faceless gaze locking onto mine. "You don't belong here," she said. "But it's too late now." I squeezed my eyes shut, counting silently in my head until the air around me shifted. When I opened them, she was gone. The worst encounter came when my coworker, Mike, decided he didn't believe in the rules. Mike was a brash guy, the kind who laughed off anything he didn't understand. He'd been working the job for a month longer than me, but he treated the rules like they were optional. One night, just past midnight, I heard him shout from the monitor room. "Hey, Alan, come look at this," he called. I rushed over, my heart sinking as I saw what he was doing. Mike was staring directly at the monitors, at one of the feeds showing the Eastern Corridor. "Mike, stop!" I yelled, but it was too late. The camera feed showed something impossible. A tall, spindly figure with limbs that bent in unnatural directions. Its face was a hollow void, black and endless. As we watched, the figure turned, staring directly at the camera. And then it smiled. The screen went black. Mike let out a nervous laugh, but his face was pale. "See? Nothing happened." He didn't show up for his next shift. Harris found his badge and a blood-stained piece of his uniform near the Eastern Corridor the following morning. Pattern emerges. The more I worked, the more I realized the rules weren't just there to protect us. They were there to protect something or someone else. The facility wasn't just a building. It was a containment site, a prison for entities that didn't belong in our world. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were part of a delicate balance. Breaking them, even once, threatened to undo everything. I began to wonder how many guards had worked here before me, how many had vanished like Mike. The thought haunted me, especially when I heard Harris mutter one night, "They always think they're special. They always break the rules." The longer I stayed, the harder it became to ignore the truth. The shadows, the footsteps, the visitor, the woman in red. They weren't anomalies. They were prisoners, and I was their warden. But even wardens make mistakes. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain lashes against the windows and the wind howls like a living thing. The power had flickered twice already, the monitors briefly sputtering to static before returning to their grainy feeds. Something about that night felt off from the start, like the air was heavier, more oppressive. Harris was unusually tense when I arrived for my shift. He lingered longer than usual, checking the cameras and flipping through the rulebook, muttering under his breath. Before he left, he grabbed my arm, his grip firm enough to make me wince. "Stick to the rules tonight," he said, his voice low. "No exceptions." I nodded, uneasy. He stared at me for a moment longer, then left without another word. The first few hours passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows on the monitors seemed darker than usual. The edges of the screen fuzzed with static that hadn't been there before. At 11:50 p.m., I started preparing for the midnight rule. I arranged the monitor feeds so I wouldn't accidentally glance at the cameras during the forbidden hour, then turned my chair to face the wall. My phone alarm was set for 1 a.m., giving me the all-clear to look again. But at 12:03 a.m., the sound began. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it quickly grew louder, filling the room with a pulsing vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded as I clenched the armrests of my chair, resisting the overwhelming urge to turn around. The hum transformed into something else, whispers, overlapping and unintelligible. They sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once, their words just beyond comprehension. "Don't look." The rulebook's warning echoed in my mind, but the whispers grew more insistent, almost pleading. "Help us," one voice murmured. "You shouldn't be here," said another. "Look, just look." My fingers dug into the armrests, my nails scraping against the fabric as I squeezed my eyes shut. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and my breathing grew shallow. The voices rose to a crescendo, then stopped abruptly, leaving the room in deafening silence. The temptation to turn around was unbearable, but I forced myself to stay still. When my alarm finally went off at 1 a.m., I was shaking. At 1:30 a.m., the footsteps began. They started in the hallway outside the monitor room, slow and deliberate, the same ones I'd heard before. But this time, they didn't stop. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. My pulse quickened as I stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. Then, a knock. It wasn't frantic or angry, just a single, steady tap. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If you hear knocking on the walls, count to 10 before responding. If the knocking continues, do not respond. I began to count, my voice barely a whisper. 1, 2, 3. The knocking came again, louder this time. 4, 5, 6. The third knock. 7, 8, 9. The fourth knock was deafening, like someone was slamming their fist against the door. I clenched my teeth and forced out the last number, 10. The room fell silent again, but the air was charged with tension. I stared at the door, waiting. When I heard it, "Alan." The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Mike's. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. Mike had been gone for days. There was no way he could be standing on the other side of that door. "Alan, let me in," the voice said, softer now, almost pleading. "It's me, man. I need your help." I clenched my fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to respond. The rulebook's warning was clear. Don't engage. The voice grew desperate. "Come on, Alan. Please. They won't let me go." I closed my eyes, tears stinging at the corners. It wasn't Mike. Couldn't be. The knocking stopped. At 2:45 a.m., I began my rounds. My hands still shook from the encounter, but I needed the distraction. The hallways were eerily quiet, the shadows longer than usual, stretching like claws along the walls. As I approached the eastern corridor, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and the faint scent of burnt wood tickled my nose. A familiar warning. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me forward. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long, and at the far end, I saw a figure. It was Mike. He stood motionless, his back to me, his uniform rumpled and stained with what looked like blood. "Mike!" I called, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. Slowly, he turned, and my heart sank. His face was wrong. It was stretched and distorted. His eyes too large and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. His skin was pale and waxy, like a mannequin's, and as he stepped closer, I saw his movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. I backed away, my legs trembling. "You're not real," I whispered, repeating the mantra in my head. "You're not real." Mike, or whatever it was, stopped. his head tilted, his grin widening. "They're coming," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Then he disappeared. By the time 3:33 a.m. arrived, I was on edge, every nerve in my body screaming for me to leave. But I couldn't. The rules wouldn't let me. I stood at the main entrance, my throat dry as I recited the familiar line, "Good evening. You're right on time." The air shifted. The scent of burnt wood stronger than ever. This time, the presence didn't stay unseen. She stepped out of the shadows, the woman in red. Her blank face seemed to stare right through me, and for the first time, she spoke directly to me. "You've broken the rules," she said, her voice soft and melodic. I stammered, but she cut me off. "Do you think they care about your intent?" she asked, tilting her head. "The rules exist for a reason, and now you've invited them in." Before I could respond, she was gone. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I stumbled out of the building, barely able to breathe. Harris was waiting by the gate, his expression grim. "You broke a rule, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, too exhausted to lie. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're lucky you made it through the night. What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Harris didn't answer. He just handed me a check and told me not to come back. As I drove away, the building vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. For weeks after I left the facility, I tried to go back to my life. I convinced myself it had all been some bizarre nightmare, the result of stress and sleepless nights. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memories or the feeling that I was still being watched. The check Harris had handed me was enough to cover my bills for a while, but the money felt cursed. Every time I spent $1, I thought about the shadow in the hallway, the whispers in the dark, the woman in red. And then the dreams started. They were always the same. I was back in the facility, walking the endless halls, the rules echoing in my mind. The shadows moved in unnatural ways. The footsteps followed me wherever I went, and the monitors showed my own reflection, smiling at me with too many teeth. I woke up sweating, gasping for air, my heart pounding like I was still there. It was a cold November evening when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to answer. "Alan Harper?" The voice on the other end was calm, detached. "Who is this?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "We need you to come back." My stomach twisted. "No, I'm done. I'm not going back there." "There's no one else," the voice said. "Harris is gone. You know the rules better than anyone. If you don't return, the consequences will be irreversible." I opened my mouth to argue, but the line went dead. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was guilt or fear or some force I couldn't understand. But 2 nights later, I found myself driving back to the facility. The gate loomed out of the fog, just as it had the first time, but this time it didn't open on its own. I stepped out of the car, my breath fogging in the freezing air, and pushed the gate open manually. It screeched on its hinges, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. The building looked the same, but it felt different. The air was heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed darker than I remembered. As I stepped inside, I saw the rulebook waiting for me on the desk. It looked newer, untouched, as if the horrors I'd endured had never happened. My shift started at midnight. This time, I didn't bother trying to fight the fear. I knew what was coming. The cameras flickered as I turned away, but I didn't need to look to know something was there. The whispers started earlier than usual, louder and more insistent. "Look at us," they begged. "We know you can hear us." I clenched my fists, staring at the wall as the whispers turned to screams. At 3:33 a.m., I made my way to the main entrance. My legs felt like lead, and my chest tightened with every step. When I reached the door, I opened it slowly, half expecting the woman in red to be waiting for me. Instead, the air shifted, colder and more oppressive than ever. "You're late," a voice said. The knocking came again, louder this time. 4, 5, 6. The third knock. 7, 8, 9. The fourth knock was deafening. like someone was slamming their fist against the door. I clenched my teeth and forced out the last number, 10. The room fell silent again, but the air was charged with tension. I stared at the door, waiting. When I heard it, Alan. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Mike's. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. Mike had been gone for days. There was no way he could be standing on the other side of that door. "Alan, let me in," the voice said, softer now, almost pleading. "It's me, man. I need your help." I clenched my fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to respond. The rulebook's warning was clear. Don't engage. The voice grew desperate. "Come on, Alan. Please. They won't let me go." I closed my eyes, tears stinging at the corners. It wasn't Mike. Couldn't be. The knocking stopped. At 2:45 a.m., I began my rounds. My hands still shook from the encounter, but I needed the distraction. The hallways were eerily quiet, the shadows longer than usual, stretching like claws along the walls. As I approached the eastern corridor, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and the faint scent of burnt wood tickled my nose. A familiar warning. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me forward. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long, and at the far end, I saw a figure. It was Mike. He stood motionless, his back to me, his uniform rumpled and stained with what looked like blood. "Mike!" I called, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. Slowly, he turned, and my heart sank. His face was wrong. It was stretched and distorted. His eyes too large and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. His skin was pale and waxy, like a mannequin's, and as he stepped closer, I saw his movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. I backed away, my legs trembling. "You're not real," I whispered, repeating the mantra in my head. "You're not real." Mike, or whatever it was, stopped. His head tilted, his grin widening. "They're coming," he said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Then he disappeared.